We're here with Liz Losh, who's an associate professor at University of California at San Diego and the director of the Culture, Art, and Technology program there. She has a new book out from MIT Press called The War on Learning, Gaining Ground in the Digital University. So there are a lot of themes in this book that I'd love to talk about, but briefly, tell us about the War on Learning. What prompted you to write this, and what's the main story here?
So it's kind of a polemical title. One of the things that I'm drawing attention to is why people imagine technology in the classroom as a site of conflict. And why do people feel like when students bring ubiquitous computing devices into learning situation that it's going to create friction with existing practices? So I actually write a lot about angry professor videos and angry student videos and sort of scenes in which it seems like there's a kind of crisis around laptops or cell phones or clickers in the classroom. And you sort of see a professor and a student melting down on camera. And what's interesting to me, is a lot of these videos are actually staged, that they're internet memes, that it requires a large number of Confederates in order to kind of create these scenes of conflict. And the other thing that's kind of interesting to me about these scenes of conflict is there seems to be kind of a cultural need to have this narrative of division, so that we need to have this kind of conflict between the older print-based culture and the practices of so-called students in the digital generation. And I'm actually pretty skeptical about how radically new the practices of the young are. I think that if you look at kind of the succession of media panics over history, there have been a lot of situations where people have decried the fact that young people are supposedly rejecting traditional ways of learning and knowing. So, The War on Learning, it's a polemical title. I wanted to get attention to the fact that I think a lot of resources are being wasted right now. And university presidents are focusing on things like, MOOCs and clickers and iPads instead of how people actually get to know each other through digital learning environments. And often how people are learning informally, like, what your average undergraduate knows about Immanuel Kant. They're going to know some stuff about Immanuel Kant based on a professor lecturing at the head of a room, but they're also going to know stuff about Immanuel Kant based on looking stuff up in Wikipedia, maybe, based on having conversations with people online, and that's part of learning as well.
So would you say that part of this conflict is that digital media over, let's say, the last 20 years, but probably particularly the last 10 years, have offered an opportunity for learning, or opportunities for learning outside of what used to be the monopoly? The schools used to be the monopoly provider of learning. 20 years ago, you couldn't go to YouTube or Wikipedia or communicate with your peers about it. You learned stuff by going to school and reading the books and taking the tests.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have made an analogy between higher education and then the news business, in that journalists used to have a single license to deliver information about the news, in a way that professors used to have this kind of license and authority to deliver knowledge, and that universities maybe will suffer as much as journalists in the news industry have if we don't think sensibly about what people want and how they want to know things. I think the sad thing is that universities have a tendency to want to use technology as a command and control device. So how do we kind of capture students' attention? How do we break learning down into a series of kind of discrete and measurable objectives? And the problem is that students don't actually retain knowledge that they learn in little tiny bits. They retain knowledge that they can integrate with their life experience. They retain knowledge that has a kind of more meaningful trajectory or arc for them. And so I think that it's really important um, to try to get away from this idea of the kind of autonomous learner reaching particular benchmarks in isolation and think about how we learn socially in ways that integrate with our entire lives, in ways that we can apply theory to practice. Because if we're not actually using our knowledge or sharing our knowledge with other people, it's not it doesn't necessarily become part of who we are. And so those students who are taking a bunch of online quizzes, I mean, it's sort of like taking one of those traffic school tutorials. You're not really going to remember the stuff that they told you about, traffic laws. You'll just remember it long enough to kind of do the summative test at the end. And essentially, that's what we're trying to do with undergraduate education. We're trying to turn it into traffic school, which, I just don't understand.
Well, I certainly agree with your critique. I agreed with it when I was a student, and I agree with it now that I'm teaching college students. What would you say prescriptively to me and to others who are teaching in a milieu in which students do have digital media, they have lives in digital media? What should we do? What should
I,
universities do?
I think the most important thing is being attentive to questions of affect. I think that there's a tendency to think that our students' emotions don't matter. And actually, how people feel about a given educational interaction is really, really important. So I would say that it doesn't really matter if you're using the latest technology. What really matters is, are you paying attention to how your students are feeling about their relationship with you and what they're getting out of the class? I think one mistake that institutions often make is they think that students love novelty. And actually, students don't love novelty, right? Sometimes they really want you to do like the old school, I'm the professor, I'm giving you some knowledge, I am the authority figure. I actually really know my stuff. They want to have that sense that uh, you understand their needs for that authoritative knowledge, and that you're willing to occupy that position of authority so that they can feel comfortable and safe. Because a lot of times, well-meaning faculty members introduce new technologies in ways that just raise the anxiety levels of their students, or they use technologies that are intended to connect their students, but actually alienate their students. So I think you need to. So speaking teacher to teacher, that would be my main piece of advice: is just kind of figure out where your students are at emotionally, and what are ways that you can use technology to facilitate that relationship rather than alienate them.
Well, in a sense, you've described a lot of the conflicts that I've gone through in my trying to teach. I teach courses on social media, so there's no avoiding the subject. But without a doubt, I ask my students to blog and to participate in forums, and there's a certain amount of anxiety involved with that. And also, when I get my anonymous evaluations, they do say, we like that you give us more responsibility and power, but you're the authority on the subject. We want to hear more from you about it. So I'm trying to steer um, a middle course there, and the way I'm framing it these days is that I think it's very important for them to try to break out of the schooling that they've had for many years, of expecting to be a passive observer of knowledge and person who passes tests. I want them to participate. I want them to co-teach. I want them to inquire, and that I am authoritative about the subject. I know the subject, but I think that if they inquire together about things that matter to them and stumble towards some of the things I want them to learn, maybe a little bit more slowly than if I had directly pointed it to them, that they will embrace that learning and engage with that learning and retain that learning better. So at the beginning, now that I have some confidence in this process, I say, this is what I will be authoritative about. I know that if just for this quarter that we're together, you kind of try some new things, I will help you facilitate creating a learning community that's a little different from the way you're expecting to learn. So I see that, and a lot of that has to do with breaking down their mistrust that I really want to know how they're feeling about what's going on. So, I
Yeah.
have them do forums, and I say, okay, how do you feel about these forums? And inevitably, they say, this is kind of alien. Can we use Facebook? And so I say, okay, let's use Facebook. I don't think Facebook does forums well, but that's how you feel. Let's go there and see what happens. And that seems to help uh, them adopt some of the other maybe innovations. And speaking of which, it's pretty clear to me that there are usually a couple of students who are ahead of me in some ways, but for the most part, I have no expectations that because they are young and they've been raised with digital media, that they know a lot about it. And I know that you are one of the people, myself included, who views this digital native idea a little bit skeptically. And I know that that skepticism is growing among educators, but I think it's worthwhile pointing it out. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great empirical evidence that's being uh, collected by social science researchers. People like Esther Hargitay, Sonia Livingston, Mimi Ito. That really shows that there's just a whole range of competencies among young people when it comes to technology, and that unfortunately, sometimes the kind of consumer model of interaction with consumer electronics really encourages a kind of lack of curiosity about how things actually work. Because when you have too slick an interface, you don't actually understand, what are the algorithms that helps it make decisions, or like what's actually inside and what are the defaults. These kinds of questions are hard to ask when you're working with something that's too prepackaged. I teach a computer language called processing that was designed for artists, but it has a very kind of low barrier to entry. And I find that actually young people, they're often reluctant to admit how little they know about how to write a computer program, because they feel like they're supposed to have this knowledge that they don't actually have, and they're ashamed and embarrassed. And so you have to kind of create these environments where people feel comfortable about noodling around with computer programming, in an environment that's safe and where failure is okay. I mean, that's another big message of the book, is I am so tired of how instructional technology gets sold with narratives of success. Like this idea that you want to introduce product X into your institution because it will magically convey all of these forms of success. I think that we need to pay attention to failure. I think that failure is really important and significant, and that's how we're all kind of move forward and get beyond these scenes of conflict. Like, I think it's important to pay attention to conflict and failure and mess and meltdown, and really talk about what makes technology hard in terms of faculty student interaction. In what ways do technology undermine what educational institutions are trying to do? In what ways do technologies bring out subversive behaviors? And I think the important thing is not to think it's just students with the subversive behaviors, right? There are lots of subversive behaviors that faculty are doing using technology as well. So, it's not just a question of, oh, us old fogies, we don't know anything about this technology, you know, um, because actually, what's interesting is to see that sometimes, for example, faculty use technology to surveil their students, which they shouldn't do. That's bad.
so I'm very glad that someone as knowledgeable as you um, is, is putting in your word in this conversation, this rather conflicted conversation about education that seems to be happening. If there were two or three things that every college president, college leader could could take from the book, what would they be?
Well, I actually, at the end of the book, I actually wrote 6 rules, essentially for college presidents to keep in mind. I think one of the really important rules is keep in mind the golden rule, right? Don't do anything that you wouldn't have wanted to have done to you when you were a student, right? So if you're creating a kind of panopticon where people are constantly being monitored in ways that, there's only like success or failure and no kind of middle ground, right? That would make you anxious as a student. So, like, don't do that to your students. And I think also um, creating occasions where, these occasions can be online, but there needs to be a sense of the ceremonial, the celebratory, that we need to create opportunities online for special time. And I think that one thing about undergraduate education is a lot of people do look back on that as special time. And I think that one of the mistakes, we can create special time digitally, right? There are digital occasions. And people who only know each other through the kinds of interfaces that you and I are talking on right now, we can have special celebratory times. But just like figuring out how to build that into the academic situation, the learning situation, so that people have a sense that, yes, there is all of this kind of grindy stuff that you're doing where you're kind of hashing things out and kind of building your knowledge base and working out your ideas, but that there are these kinds of occasions where people are recognized, where people are celebrated. And I think that too much of this kind of learning benchmark thinking takes away the kind of pomp and ceremony and wonderfulness that attracts people to university life. And like, why not have those moments of kind of pomp and silliness as part of our online learning as well?
All right. You said there were 6 of those pieces of
Yeah,
advice.
there's the one about novelty. So don't be in love with things just because they're new. That's certainly an important principle, I think, to keep in mind. There are a lot of principles that have to do with thinking about uh, uh, how conflict unfolds or how messiness unfolds, and not wanting this kind of sanitized view of technology. Because I think that's also a common mistake that university presidents make.
Well, I think it's a good idea not to give all of the book away. I commend this
Yeah,
book
put it
to university
in the university
administrators.
questions mailbox. It's a very unsubtle hint about why I think that. I mean, there are literally millions of dollars being spent right now that could be supporting first generation students. They could be doing a lot of other interesting things with technology. I mean, there's this tendency to want to spend money on technology in ways that create a good press release. And I think that's just a disastrous approach to instructional technology. This is not about photo ops. This is about learning.
Oh, that is such a great place to end. So thanks so much, Liz.
Okay, thanks.